Live, hopefully. Let's see if it's working on the stream. Watch me if I like set it up wrong and I have to do it again.
That's all right.
Oh yeah, there we go. It's all good. So, yeah, that's looking cool. Sorted. Would you like? Do you want to give an introduction then, just to kind of cover who Anselm is, what kind of drove him to do his works, how what his upbringing was like, what
Sure, yeah.
Where do you want to stop?
Yeah, because he's kind of an unusual guy in that respect.
So yeah, so in my reading, what I came across was he was kind of born into nobility, of sorts, maybe like what we might call upper middle class type thing.
Yeah, but definitely nobility in the sense of being expected to possibly be a knight or move into the clergy or something like that.
Right. Okay.
You know?
And then was it his mother died or his father died?
His mother dies eventually, yeah, and he was very close to her, and his father. Either his father was kind of a jerk, or he and Anselm just had personality conflicts, but they didn't get along at all.
So he kind of goes off then, and there's a period where there's not much known about him, is my understanding. And then he decides, and I think there was something I was reading where it was saying, like he had a bit of a conflict about whether he should intellectually pursue things, or whether he was kind of like in a sense of calling maybe to do something else. And he was like, well, it's all going off at Beck, so I'm going to go towards there. Is that?
Yeah, he did have a weighing of what we nowadays call discernment, when people decide whether they have some sort of vocation, particularly a religious vocation. And that several years of traveling around France, we don't actually know what he did. We just know that he sinned in some way because he regrets it later and doesn't quite name whatever it was, but he does have a lament for lost virginity. So maybe
So
part of it.
It's always the one, isn't it?
Yeah, and he wavers between Beck and a few other monasteries once he realizes that he wants to be a monk. And to become a monk at that time, part of it was this religious desire. I want to spend more time thinking about God and praying and doing that. But it also meant engaging in study, because the Benedictine monasteries, they were essentially centers of culture. And so you've got places like Cluny that are really well established by that time, have a very ornate and elaborate liturgy, and you really don't do much other than follow the rule and do your work and do the prayers. But he also was attracted to Beck because Lanfranc was there.
Right.
Lanfranc was a brilliant guy who eventually becomes Archbishop of Canterbury under William the Conqueror. And so Anselm, according to his biographer, Admer, and there's no reason to think that this is false, thinks that I'm tempted to be kind of proud of my intellect. If I go to some place where there's somebody else who clearly overshadows me, I'll have daily reminders of the fact that I'm not as bright as I think I am. And then within just a short time of getting there, Lanfranc gets kicked upstairs. So that gets removed, and a lot of Anselm's life is like one, and you can't even call them necessarily happy accident after another, because he's not often happy about them. He starts out with a plan for something, and then something changes. He views it as essentially providential, but he, for somebody who views everything as providential, he sure kicks against it quite a bit. He doesn't think that you can immediately assume things are as they ought to be. So he tries not to be abbot. He tries not to be Archbishop of Canterbury.
So when he's before he's kind of Archbishop of Canterbury, when he's still in the monastery, is he mostly teaching, or what's kind of, is he like we think of a university today and what professors do? Is it anything like that, or what's kind of going on?
Yeah, so that's a good question. When he was just a monk, he would be occupied with whatever jobs they assigned to him, and some of that would probably involve some measure of study or copying manuscripts or things like that. That was one way that they kept books in circulation. So we know from letters that he writes later on, he'll say, hey, you guys over there, you've got the, Gregory's Moralia and Job. Can you send it over here so we can copy it out? So that would be part of it. And then there's all sorts of other related things. There's different functions within a Benedictine monastery. There's a huge emphasis placed on hospitality. So taking in, the sick or people who are traveling, that would be an important part of it. And then they would also have people detailed outside of the property, and Benedictines still do this today. As a matter of fact, St. Meinrad's monastery in southern Indiana has monks all over the place in the Midwest doing mission work, including parish work. So, you might actually be sent as far as England for some of the holdings to do things. And we don't actually know whether he just stayed there or whether he went off on those tours or not. And then when he became prior, the prior is sort of like in a military unit, the executive officer, or sort of like in a modern day corporation, the chief operations officer. Sure. They're not the guy on top or woman on top, but they handle a lot of the day-to-day stuff. And for these monks, that also meant teaching. And that's when he starts doing some of his writing. The Monologion comes out of that. Okay. And as you've read, his motive for writing it is the monks wouldn't leave him alone and kept pestering him to write stuff down because they liked his teaching and couldn't keep it in their heads. So he wrote the stuff down. Then becoming abbot is a whole different situation, because once you're an abbot, you effectively have the powers of a bishop within the realm of your monastery.
Okay. So more to do with like practical matters as well then?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't bishops are supposed to be responsible for the teaching of the faith within their entire diocese. And, sometimes they're good at that and sometimes they don't seem to care much about that at all throughout history. But I guess you could say that the abbot has that responsibility as well. But the previous abbot, the first founder of Bec, wasn't particularly literate. Herluin was just a soldier who really found himself attracted to monastic life and had enough money to start a monastery. So abbot was probably the first really literate bishop, or not abbot. And as abbot, you got to deal with all of the nonsense that goes along with a monastery. We often picture these people are going behind the cloister walls and leaving the world behind. But no, you bring the world in there with you. Right. And all the same nonsense that you and I deal with out in the world, they have to deal with as well. Personality conflicts, jealousies. There's even, Anselm writes in the De Similitudinibus about how the people who were given the oblati, they were given as children to the monks, because that's what you do with like a third or fourth kid. They would get in arguments with the people who were the conversi, the ones who had chosen later in life to become monks, about which ones were the real monks. So clearly there were lots of issues that you'd have to deal with as an abbot, and bring your authority to bear on and do some practical reasoning about that. And you might monkey around with some of the practices. Anselm seems to have done some somewhat different things with the table talk that would happen in monasteries than some of the other people would. And then he gets stuck being bishop, which he didn't want to do at all. He didn't want to even be abbot, but to become archbishop took him away from his monastery, meant that he had to deal with these troublesome English kings.
Well, he had I didn't realize he was the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1066, which, as someone who's in England, 1066 it's something that is.
Well, he gets exiled twice, under two different kings, because there's so much back and he almost, we shouldn't really turn people into verbs like this, but he almost got Thomas Becketed. In a way, because of the conflict going on there between church and state. And I think that, he was certainly better known for those sorts of things in his own time than he was for, the ontological argument or anything like that. Yeah, sure.
Because I read some letters he'd written to like the daughter of a Saxon noble or something.
Oh, yeah.
And he was like, Yeah, and it's like, because you think of, I don't know, a philosopher or whatever, or so, someone who's a figure in philosophy, and you think, yeah, they're just in their ivory tower doing da 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 da. But he's actually like dealing with this whole political, like it really made him a real person for me, kind of reading some of those
The
things.
letters are really
Uh,
important, actually, especially for an author like Anselm, who writes treatises but never actually addresses everything that you'd want him to do. And we can talk about why that's the case in a bit. But you actually bring up a really important point, which is that for most of the people that we read in the history of philosophy, even the ones who were, say, university professors like Thomas Aquinas, or wished they were like David Hume,
right,
who's prevented from being so because of correct rumors of his atheism.
right,
Um, they were living lives and very often involved with all sorts of other matters, and typically were drawing their ideas and impetuses for writing about this or that from what was going on at the time, real practical issues. That's why good history of philosophy isn't just like summarizing, well, what were their doctrines and who led to who. It's
okay,
locating them in their time. And in recent years, there's been this sort of recovery of what they call philosophy as a way of life.
mm,
And people who talk in those terms usually bring up, Pierre Hadot. But that's been the norm for philosophy throughout most of philosophy's career. Even people like Rene Descartes, who we typically teach as if he's just doing, experiments in epistemology, he was mostly doing science and wanted to provide some sort of basis for, being able to explain what was going on, and he pulled his book right off the market when Galileo got condemned because he was relying
right,
on Galilean elements, and reintroduces that stuff with the discourse, and then gets involved in the politics of the 30 Years' War. All of these things are part of who these people are. And so
mm,
Anselm sticks out perhaps a bit more, in part because I think because most people don't know him in terms of philosophy very much unless they study medieval philosophy. So it's easy to especially since he's got the saint title, to associate him with other things.
yeah,
But that's really the norm for most people in philosophy. Even the analytic philosophers, more had to admit that he spent more time reading novels than he did actually reading
okay.
philosophy, and he thought there was something to that.
Yeah. I didn't even realize the big kind of contentious divide between modern analytic and continental philosophy before I spoke to my friend a couple of months ago who's actually done, like a philosophy degree. And I was like, oh, I didn't even have any idea that was such,
I think it's
such
kind
a
of
huge.
overblown too.
Yeah.
I think they get a lot more out of its existence. I think it's good to think of like modern analytic philosophy and contemporary continental philosophy as two very parochial camps that want to
Okay.
think that they're the entire show.
Yeah, sure.
Whereas there's also classical American philosophy,
Right. Like
which isn't just
pragmatism, William
pragmatism.
James. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it goes all the way back to people like Jonathan Edwards,
Okay.
who's drawing upon Locke, but bringing in Calvinist theology and trying to tie them together. The Transcendentalists, who are taking German philosophy, mainly through Coleridge, and then applying it and all this sort of nature-based stuff. There were St. Louis Hegelians.
Right.
There were all sorts of threads in classical American philosophy, and pragmatism is probably the brightest of those threads, you could say.
Okay.
And then there's two vast traditions of thought that are each as voluminous as Western philosophy, Indian philosophy, and Chinese philosophy. Then there's comparative philosophy, where we're looking at, can we bring these together? There's always been philosophy as a way of life, or what McIntyre calls tradition-constituted rationalities going on.
Okay.
So there's always been a lot of different games in town, and the analytics and continentals got a lot of mileage out of claiming they were the whole
Yeah.
show.
Yeah.
And
So,
I think they still do. And a lot of it has to do, it's kind of interesting. So there's a bit of a tangent. But we live in this
yeah, sorry.
internet age, right? Where we're communicating right now over video conferencing, and it's streaming out to people, and people can listen to this and watch this who've never met you or I. And who knows how long this data is going to remain in existence. Might be there long after you and I are dead. This could be part of some database for somebody.
Right.
So, it used to be in the old days, you could say, well, I went to schools where all they had were analytic and continental philosophers, and the analytics dominated. And then there were the few token people who did work on Nietzsche or, Foucault or something like that. Yeah. But nobody can really make that excuse for their lack of awareness of what's going on now, because there's so much available to find out what's happening in the world of philosophy. And I get called upon every once in a while to give talks on the analytic continental divide. And each time I go in, I'm just surprised that it's still there. I mean,
probably just like a tribalism thing though, right? As well, like,
yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's sort of like here in America with our political parties, right?
Oh, you cut out a second.
Divide everything into Democrat or Republican, and we do have third parties, but they're like totally fangless because of the way we've got our system set up. It's not like other places where, like in Britain, where the liberal Democrats could crash and burn and then come back. So we've seen that happen. Or, in France, where you have a wide range of parties. We just have these two things, and then a lot of people act as if, well, that's the only possibilities we've ever had.
Yeah.
And it has to do more with sociological factors than anything purely conceptual.
Yeah. So for Anselm then, at the time where he's kind of doing his major works, what would be the influences on his philosophy? What would he have available to him, like manuscripts of Greeks or what?
Yeah, so he wouldn't be able to read Greek, but he could read Latin, and there were a few things that were translated from Greek into Latin, in part because of Boethius. So if we jump back to, two very important influences on Anselm are Romans who didn't realize that they were going to later be called medievals. As a matter of fact, Anselm doesn't think of himself as a medieval because there's no Middle Ages at that time. But Augustine and Boethius are both effectively Christian Neoplatonists, which means that they're not just, using Plato, but they're also well conversant with Aristotelian and Stoic philosophy, and it's all this kind of hash that's going on. And they've also read earlier Christian thinkers too, like say Lactantius or John Cassian would be a contemporary to Augustine. And so Boethius had this amazing idea that he saw the things falling apart. I mean, Rome had already fallen. He ends up getting jailed and then executed by Theodoric, one of these German princes who gets to be the emperor for a while. And he wants to translate all of Plato and Aristotle into Latin because he knows that, education is declining. He manages to translate the categories and on interpretation, if I remember right. And that's about it. But he writes commentaries on this stuff as well. And if I remember right, he also translated the Timaeus. They did have the Plato's Timaeus available.
So they've got justified true beliefs or whatever, or is that where?
No, that's that. You're thinking about the Theaetetus.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah.
Timaeus is about the creation of the universe.
And,
there's a lot of like bits of interesting stuff kind of mixed in there, like how the senses work and all of that. But they knew about what Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and other people had to say from other sources because Cicero had been saved, and Seneca, who they thought was a Christian, had been saved. And Epictetus, his Enchiridion, had been preserved, although they changed some of the terms. So Socrates becomes Christ, and the philosopher becomes a monk. Right? It was kind of
that's very interesting.
Yeah, and so they had all this stuff, and they had plenty of other pagan authors as well, who they really enjoyed and loved. And then they had this whole set of other authors that we now know as like church fathers and doctors. So it varied from monastery to monastery, but they tried as best as they could to disseminate books pretty widely. And, they'd already gone through essentially two dark ages. The dark ages and the Middle Ages are actually not that long. The first one is things breaking apart in the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, trying to intervene and not being able to be all that successful. And then things break apart. Then you have the Carolingians, and you have a Renaissance with that, and you
Right.
have the Alcuin and people, like that coming on the scene, and their writings would be available. And then you have the Norse come in and screw things up again for everybody else.
Yeah.
But by the time that Anselm is around, the Norse have become the Normans, and they're pretty civilized.
Right.
Even the ones in Norway have become pretty civilized.
My only source for this is all the seasons of Vikings, the TV show, by the way.
Oh, okay.
I've not read much history.
I don't know how accurate that show is, because I've never watched it.
I don't know that it's very.
I mean, the History Channel. You don't mind me going off on a little bit of.
Oh yeah, don't worry. Yeah. Well,
so my first full-time teaching job was from 2002 to 2008, teaching in a maximum security prison.
Okay.
And I taught like a whole range of classes, because we had to teach the entire curriculum for philosophy and religious studies. And there was me doing it full time, and then there was one other guy who used to work over a couple different prisons. And so I'd teach a lot of classes that had a historical component, and I'd get all these students who had seen things on the History Channel, and I hadn't realized that the History Channel had gone so far downhill in terms of reporting actual history. And so I got
ancient aliens over and over.
Oh yeah, well, not just that, but if you're teaching anything that had to do with like New Testament or Old Testament studies, they would always intervene these like totally fringe people and present them as if they're the mainstream scholarship. Okay. And so these guys, they didn't have a lot of access to texts, and they did have cable TV in prison. And so they would come in and they'd say, hey, I saw this thing on the History Channel that said that Jesus was this and this and this. And I'd be like, what? And then they'd say, it's this is what the scholarship says. I mean, that doesn't sound right at all. So then I'd go and look it up, because by then we had, of course, had the internet. And it would be like this one guy who they'd interviewed who had the wildest claims whatsoever. And I think that's unfortunately, the Learning Channel started doing that. A lot of these TV cable channels, they had great promise. And it was the same promise, by the way, that in the 1950s, when television first started becoming big, here in America, it was envisioned that it would be essentially educational.
Right. Okay.
And it did manage to be more like that, say, in Britain, with the BBC. There was some control over it, but we gave it over to commercial stations like immediately, and within like 3-4 years.
That's what did it, the privatization.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they realized you could sell all sorts of things and make money on that, and that you really needed high ratings, and quite frankly, strictly educational things that are based on real research aren't usually that exciting.
So you end up with the Kardashians.
Going back to Anselm, right? If we'd said that Anselm, had gotten in a fist fight with William Rufus, and that's how he got the bloody nose on the way to the cathedral. Totally made up story. He did get a bloody nose, we know, on the way to the cathedral, but it's because they're trying to push the crozier into his hand, and he's trying to prevent it. And he's an old guy by the time that happens. We could probably sell a lot more stories about Anselm. There was a period too, I'll mention, where there was speculation about whether Anselm was actually gay or not.
Oh, really?
And a lot of it was based on the letters, because he has these very effusive.
This is like everyone who ever wrote anything in history, though, as well.
What's that?
This seems to me that I feel like everyone who's ever written anything in history, there's always like going to be a debate over whether or not they were gay, like Shakespeare, for example, or you know what it like.
Yeah, because you can always find something where they're expressing some love, and you'd be like, well, see, definitely means this, and why didn't he get married? Well, he's a monk.
Yeah.
But there's that was sort of a thing that rose in popularity for a while, and then most scholars were like, nah, that doesn't really.
Was this like contemporary to him? Sorry, or was this is like later on?
Oh no, much. This is be like in probably the 1990s, early 2000s. We think that probably William Rufus was bisexual or something like that, and that may have been part of what Anselm didn't like about the guy.
Right, interesting.
So
Or maybe he was secretly attracted to him, and that was.
Oh, Anselm?
I don't know.
I don't think he found anything about William Rufus attractive, quite frankly.
So for before I degenerate the conversation even more, I'll say, what was the kind of relationship between faith and reason then for Anselm?
Oh,
Because and this is even contemporary today.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
conservative evangelical apologetics is like trying to define faith in a very particular way.
Yeah.
But for say someone like Anselm, it's really interesting because this famous quote of, I suppose, faith seeking understanding is kind of
Yeah.
attributed to him. And yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of a reworking of Augustine's quotation of the Septuagint version of Isaiah, unless you believe you
Oh,
will
okay.
not understand, right?
Right.
Which for the Latins was, I suppose, for the Greek Orthodox too, would be normative, but then wouldn't be there in the Protestant
Right. Okay.
sort of retranslation or reedition of Scripture.
Yeah.
And yeah, so what is the fides that's seeking it? So Anselm uses words like faith and reason in at best analogical, perhaps we might say equivocal ways. But that's not really a problem for him, because he says the word will, for example, is used in equivocal ways. So we just have to clarify what they are. And faith could be this kind of blind belief that a person has that operates as the sort of starting point. So, if you look at Anselm's use of Scripture, he often gets tarnished as being like a hardcore rationalist, and it's usually evangelicals who are saying this about him. Although neo-scholastics, certain kinds of Thomists will like to say that as well. Okay. And it's because he'll say that, listen, if something's in Scripture and it doesn't actually make any sense, we're probably not understanding it correctly.
Okay.
And we'd better try to figure out a way in which it actually does make sense. And what is our tool for doing that? Human reason, right? I mean, you could say, well, you could adopt something like the Protestant perspicuity of Scripture and say, well, you've always got another quote that makes sense of that.
Yeah.
But you're also using human reason to understand that quote as well.
Or you can just say, the Holy Spirit told you, and so you've got an infallible. I've seen some people, and it becomes real messy that way.
That's like, people who do that are using a sort of an appeal to infallibility that's wilder than anything ever attributed to, even in like the heyday of like all Catholics just listen to the Pope.
Yeah.
They all in effect make themselves their own Pope, or if we want to think about Islam, they all in fact make themselves like the Shiite imam,
right.
And usually along with that, so the 12er Shiite imam is supposed to be not only infallible but also impeccable as well.
Okay.
So yeah, those sorts of things are quite dangerous.
So it doesn't for Anselm. This faith word then.
Yeah.
Is he like a fideist then? Would you say, or?
Well, I mean, a fideist is usually at the opposite end of a rationalist, right? Everything.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Because it seems he's saying like you've got faith first, and then you seek the understanding on top. Like
faith first, but faith is kind of inchoate. Faith doesn't actually always know what it has faith in.
Oh, okay.
So you're making some sort of commitment, but then you have to work to understand what it is that you're committed to. Okay. And he like Augustine or like other thinkers that are within the early Christian tradition will say God is going to help us figure this stuff out, but God is going to help us figure this stuff out by the application of the faculties that God gave us to do this, that are how we're different than the stupid animals.
Yeah.
And we could get on all sorts of side things. Well, maybe elephants are rational, but they're not rational in the same way we are.
I saw a video of an ape called Coco that was taught sign language yesterday.
Yeah.
And they gave a cat to this ape called Coco. This is sorry, I'm going off on a tangent now, but they gave this gorilla. It was this kitten, and it would stroke the kitten, play with the kitten, and all that. And one day the kitten kind of wandered off, and it got hit by a car. So the woman told Coco about that the kitten got, but the way the gorilla then articulated its abstract emotional response, that freaked me out like nothing. has freaked me out on the internet for a
Yeah,
long time.
I am very interested in what we now know about animal behavior and what its implications are for this division that in the past, and this isn't just like
especially theologically between
well,
humanity and
yeah, but it's one that goes way back into the ancients,
right.
and you find the Platonists, the Aristotelians, the Stoics, they don't agree on everything, but there's one
Mm,
thing they do agree on, which is that we are the rational creature. There might be
right.
other ones like angels or gods or whatever the hell they are, that help out the universe. It gets very
Yeah.
hazy once we get into cosmology, but it's clear that they think that there's us and then there's the beasts. And when we're failing on our part, it's by not using reason sufficiently and degenerating to the level of mere beasts. But and there's some beasts that we definitely wouldn't want to degenerate to the level of. Insects probably don't have much of an emotional life,
Right.
may not have any sort of cognition. But the notion that somehow, like Descartes was putting forward, cats are essentially just meat machines.
Yeah.
If you ever lived with cats
Or
long,
even a cat can't, right? His kind of ethics is
yeah. Well, a lot of those modern philosophers, the exceptions would be people like, interestingly, materialists like Hobbes,
right. Oh,
because
okay.
well, we're all just machines,
Yeah.
so machines have to be more complicated. Or Rousseau, or
Okay.
Hume, or people like that. And we don't want to romanticize animals and fantasize that somehow they're on the same level as us, just by having emotions, or even maybe their
Mm,
emotions don't have the same structures as ours. There's something definite about the human being in being the rational animal that does set us apart, but it may not be this thing that always dignifies us. It makes us
mm,
more dangerous. We're the
yeah.
animal
Yeah.
that kills all the others. Even lions, tend to run away from threats. We're the only ones that decide to go and kill the threats. All chimps do too. They kill
Mm.
other bands
And
of
and
chimps.
and to say warfare between. I mean, I suppose ants and things do that, but you watch like
Yeah,
chimps go to war, and the way they'll march in like single file lines to hide their numbers, things like that.
yeah,
The way they'll
yeah,
tear each other apart and not. It freaks me out, that whole thing.
yeah. But so anyway, maybe rationality is kind of an open-ended thing. And here's another idea that doesn't just come from, say, Anselm, but the Stoics say this, and
Hmm.
you know, we as rational creatures aren't really fully rational. It's not like an
No.
on-off switch that
Yeah.
we have, so that going back to the faith reason thing, we're always using imperfect reason to understand what it is that we would start out with faith. And there might be some things where we could discover it just by use of reason and not relying on, say, scripture or religious experience or something along those lines. But like Thomas says when he's talking about the natural law and the divine law,
Mm,
having some God giving something on God's side sure does help out a lot. When
right.
things are murky.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then it doesn't mean that you can't necessarily require everybody else to suddenly line up behind your experience or insight. You have to use rational means to
Okay.
communicate that to them. And so there's that component of faith, but faith for Anselm is also a matter of action. So in the Monologian, towards the end, he says that faith without works or commitment or action is a dead faith.
Right.
Yeah, if you really actually do have faith, there's some things that you'll do, and some of those might be mental acts.
Okay.
Like having faith, for example, that if we're trying to figure this complicated stuff out, that God will actually help us. That might be an expression of it. So
Okay.
boldly thinking things,
Yeah.
that could be an aspect of it. But it'll also extend to, like, political questions, like thinking, well, the king is pretty powerful, and the bishops, I don't know if they actually are going to line up with me. York is always raising trouble. Would like to claim to be equal in stature to Canterbury. Maybe I should give in. Faith is
Yeah.
what leads you to say. Well, you could add to that too. Man, my monks are suffering. The people under me are suffering because the king can use state power against all of them. Maybe I should just, give in.
Right.
And Anselm doesn't. And part of the reason he doesn't is he thinks that he's been given this responsibility that he has to bear against whatever powers are brought to bear. And he's actually, you could think of him as, in a certain sense, an agent of not the Pope as such, but the reforms that the Pope is attempting to impose across the whole matrix of Western Christianity, which for the most part were, decent things to do. Some of them had to do with like regularizing practices and all of that, but that brought him into a lot of conflict with people. And so faith could be sometimes saying, okay, I'm going to stick with this, and something good will come out of this.
And he's not thinking then of what he's doing in employing his intellect as necessarily like, so this is the category of philosophy over here, this is the category of that. He's, it's all kind of, it's service in the kingdom using intellect. Is that?
Yeah, and I think you could say that although people knew that there was a discipline that we could call philosophy, right? And that could be understood as being somewhat different than theology or whatever we want to call it. It was a blurry line sort of thing for the thinkers of that time. It wasn't rigidly distinguished into having different faculties in universities, because these were monastic schools. And another thing to keep in mind is that the monastic life was itself often called Christian philosophy, because philosophy was understood as not simply a theoretical activity that you would carry out, but as inherently practical. So yeah.
So for I suppose one of the, I don't know which of his works it'd be more interesting to go to first. How much time, more time have you got, kind of thing? About
an hour.
Okay. Maybe then what might be useful on truth, these kind of two levels of truth, truth in the mind versus outside the mind, and then from the monologian, kind of that being nested within God. Could you explain those kind of things a bit more, what he's talking about?
I don't think of them as like two levels of truth as such. I'm not sure. That's probably coming from some secondary literature.
Yeah, that's
who's talking in those terms? I'm kind of curious to know.
Sister Benedicta Ward is talking in those terms. She's at Harris Manchester, Oxford.
Yeah, that's very funny, because she's the translator of the prayers and meditations.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Where I wouldn't expect that sort of thing from her. So in On Truth, there's a couple things that are going on. One that's quite useful is a distinction between different sorts of truth in signification, and this also applies to thought as well. So saying that, if here's an example that Anselm could use, it's raining right now. That's true if it's actually raining right now. It's not true here in Milwaukee, as far as I know. It's probably true somewhere else. It's
probably true here.
Yeah, and what makes it true is, we might say, this isn't Anselm's terms, but the coincidence or mapping onto the linguistic things, and then the reality outside. And then there's other things that are always going to be true, and some of those could be what we nowadays call tautologies.
Yeah.
And Anselm tended to think of some of those things as being within the divine mind, being sort of truths, we could say, that are in God's mind, which then we can participate in some way and understand. And so there's truth of signification has this sort of, you could call it externally oriented thing, but there's also like the truth within the language itself. So calling something by its name, or saying things about it, like, say, dogs, wag their tails. Now you could go around and look at all the dogs and see whether they do in fact wag their tails, and you could quibble too. So, well, that dog doesn't have a tail, it got cut off, or birth defect, something like that. But in general, you're talking about the way things are, and Anselm thinks that in some way our capacity to talk about these contingent things of the world is dependent on having in the mind these other truths, right?
Okay.
And he says that we can think of this operating that way for thought and for language or expression. And then he goes on further and he says there's also truth in action and truth in the will. And here's where it starts to get kind of wilder, right. Where a lot of epistemologists would say, I'm not going with you, buddy, on that one, right?
Right.
Because what does he mean by truth in the will? Truth in the will is what he will later call justice, or rectitude of will maintained for its own sake, which is a central idea in his entire ethics. And there's a lot of different modalities of this that get fleshed out in other works, and especially in the letters, and especially in the prayers and meditations. But the idea is that there are some sort of norms within the structure of the universe, and we ought to be aligning our wills with those. And part of the reason why we have a faculty of reason is so that we don't do it in a purely mechanical way, so we can respond to different situations and figure it out. And so actions can be true, the will can be true, and then there's also a truth within the very fabric of things. That's there to go. If we look back at the Monologion, that's a reflection of the creation of the universe according to the, we might say, blueprint that's there in the Word, in the second person of the Trinity. So Anselm thinks that, and he's not very he's not very forthcoming about all this. And you have to do a bit of reading the Monologion into this, and reading other later works back into that. But the central picture is that God is truth with a capital T. God is the truth that's more true than any truth that we're ever going to come across, including even the truth of the entire world itself. And so everything is in truth, so to speak, just like everything is, as he says at the end, in time. And then there's all these other
notion of an ultimate reality or something.
That's God, yeah. And it's not as if that ultimate reality is anything we could ever master or completely have in our mind. So when we're thinking about, to jump into the proslogion, or think about what's going on in the Monologion, when we're thinking about God, it's not as if we actually have a little godlet in our mind doing stuff or something like that. Our conception of God participates, like an image or something like that, in the reality that is God.
Right.
So it's always less true, but it's true enough, you could say. And the more true something is for Anselm, the more real it is.
I was going to say it's really difficult, I find, as like when we talk about all these things and what they mean in terms of epistemology or language, what's it mapping to and stuff. I've got all a bit of Wittgenstein coming up, a bit of this guy, and I'm it's very difficult for me to get contextually thinking in that kind of way. I guess empiricism and human stuff is so difficult. Do you think there's still value in what Anselm's talking about in his truth here? How would he respond to, say, the way it's been articulated in?
Well, you'd probably say that in a lot of those cases, people have sort of willingly picked ways of making sense of things. They're going to blot out anything that doesn't fit their schema, and that sucks for them.
Okay.
But it's definitely not incumbent upon us to accept that. Hume is an interesting case. I really like Hume quite a bit, even though I think he's wrong on
me too.
Yeah. I think he is right about pretty much anything we can think of can probably be imagined differently. I don't draw the conclusion that he does, so that therefore we can't ever, be completely sure about it or something like that, because maybe that's something wrong with the imagination. But he is right about that. And I think he is probably right in asserting that, we never do have an experience of cause and effect, or things along those lines.
And I was thinking specifically in terms of maybe more kind of empiricist, matters of fact, relations of ideas and things.
The Hume's fork thing.
Yeah.
I've never bought that myself.
Okay. Is that one?
And I think that, one of the problems with it is it doesn't work for self-referentiality. This is something you see as an undergraduate. Just like, Ayer's verification principle can't be verified. So that should that doesn't automatically count as a refutation, but that should clue us into that. There must be some either deeper explanation of it, or there must be some fundamental problem with looking at things in this way. And so it's interesting. Somebody like Anselm would say that not only is that a mistaken way of looking at things, but that in some respect we're responsible for having chosen
Right.
a wrong-headed way of doing it. You know,
Really?
when I was going back to looking at what he says to Ganillo,
Hmm.
he accuses Ganillo of unjustly saying things about him, meaning that Ganillo should have known better. And
As in he's
there's
choosing from like a heart of sin or something? Would that be like, oh, I don't.
Yeah, I don't know that it would be like sinful as such, but it could easily lead you adopting the wrong sort of overarching epistemological structure could lead you to not grasping what you need to grasp as a human being.
Right.
You know, because you rule it out, and it's not. I don't know that it would constitute a sin as such, but it would certainly make it easier to not know what you need to know, so that you do end up sinning later on in some way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's
Um,
interesting.
yeah. So you know, and there was another interesting thing I thought about, because I thought something like this might come up. Kate Rogers, who's she's got a couple recent books out on Anselm that are quite good, mostly dealing with Anselm and freedom. She
Right.
wrote a book about Anselm's Neoplatonic metaphysics, and then that was her dissertation actually at Notre Dame, and then she followed it up with some articles. And she pointed out that Neoplatonism is not particularly thriving today, but everybody has a metaphysics.
Yeah.
And when you really get down to it, nobody really has any convincing arguments for why we should prefer their fundamental metaphysics over another one, in the sense that they're going to ever achieve consensus. It's more like you read their stuff and you're like, that sounds, pretty plausible. I can buy into this 75%. Or like William James in The Will to Believe says, a lot of our arguments about this are really based on our passional nature. He'll talk in terms of temperament as well. And so Kate Rogers says in this thing, in a footnote, she says, a lot of people might not accept Neoplatonism as a metaphysical basis, but all the metaphysical bases that they have are just as plausible or implausible as that, and you pick which one you want to work with.
Mm.
And the fact of it being out of favor at this particular point in time, given if we look at sort of a vast historical scope, that doesn't argue for much, because there's been plenty of things that have gone out of vogue and then come back in later on with some additional thinking about it. So we have to decide. What we have to do is we have to be clear about what our commitments actually are. We don't have to try to get everybody on the same board as us. And for me, just speaking personally,
Mm-hmm.
I think that I'm more willing to entertain the ones that provide a more interesting and rich picture of reality than the ones that are more tractable, because they reduce reality down to what's more manageable. So over time, I found things like the empiricist project, as you find it in, say, Hume, and then later in the people like Ayer, the whole sort of verificationist thing. I just found it so reductive as to be uninteresting.
Okay. Yeah. Is it? I don't know how familiar you are with, I suppose, what's going on in the world of, say, like apologetics and atheist apologetics and things, how it's being used through the internet these days. But there's a
Yeah.
really fascinating guy called Tom Jump, if you see, there's a thing called Modern Day Debate, where they seem to be a platform that's growing, where people are having these debates about certain topics.
Yeah.
So he's done an undergrad in philosophy or something, and he's written an interesting. He basically he just attacks Christianity from this epistemological position, saying that
Okay.
any metaphysical claims are unjustified because some undiscovered natural property, pantheism, whatever, has equally as much explanatory scope as all the attributes of divine aseity, but we have no empirical justification for saying any of the attributes of divine deity.
Yeah,
So
that's a very
it's quite,
abstract project that he's got there, and I bet he feels really good about it. It's sort of like setting up an amazing Lego castle, but you can't actually live in it. There's and one of the things that, so I'll say this first. One of the things that I've noticed about atheists for the last, say, 30 years or so, that I've been paying more attention to this and being involved in the world of thought, is that very little of what they have to say ever turns out to be particularly new.
Okay.
So you go back and you read atheist Christian polemics from the early 20th century. It's the same stuff over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And I'll say too that very little on the Christian side tends to be very new either.
Yeah.
Which is probably a good thing, because a lot of the newer stuff probably isn't very, very good.
I fight with that.
The other thing too is most of the atheists that I see wind up being sort of crusaders of secularism or atheism, and they would fall just as prey to somebody like a Nietzsche coming along and saying, you got to actually look into the void and see that all this reliance on science as if it's the new foundation, that's just as groundless as anything else, and just as much based on your own wishes and desires.
You can't get the oughts and the morality, and it's like, oh, you're watching a film this evening, why are you even doing that?
Anyway, going back to this, the way that, if he is the way that you've described him, this project is like that, it sounds like something that wouldn't appeal to many people, because it's already requiring so many pretty big commitments about the way language works and logic works, and what can be the case for accounts about the universe.
I think it's going back to that thing you said about TV and stuff earlier. Now, he does generally he's better educated than many of his guests, but he does have conservative evangelical professors and things on. Yeah. And I think it's he does a very good job. He's done a very good job of actually, I think, dealing with them with some thought experiments and things, because I don't know, but Chris Gadsden, have you ever heard of him? I think he's a PhD in epistemology.
I'm not very well read though on any of that sort of contemporary stuff,
Yeah. So I think he's an epistemology professor, and he was on, and there was an interesting conversation about kind of the ad hocness of first cause argument, God or versus something else, or
and there's something to that. I mean, when I present this stuff in class, because I go over Thomas's 5 ways pretty much every semester, I run through the things, and I try to flesh it out a little bit as well. Mm-hmm. But you're like, that doesn't look remotely like what we call God.
Yeah. I think that's true for a lot of philosophy, which is why, again, I think for a lot of some conservative evangelicals can be like, well, I've got this view of what is true, and so you're doing all this first cause, and it's alienating. I just want Jesus. But
there are a lot of conservative evangelicals too that seem to be very into, we might call it rationalist apologetics. I can give you this argument and this argument. Thomas has become quite popular among Protestants in a weird way. Mm-hmm. The last 20 years was quite a surprise to me, because it used to be, if you're a Protestant, you don't read that terrible guy because he's the Catholic philosopher. But then they found resources.
Oh yeah, you don't want to know what I've heard about him being a heretic and stuff, and I'm just like, yeah, okay, I think I'm still gonna read the Summa Theologica. What are you gonna do?
Well, that's actually a little bit of a digression. We should read the people who we disagree with, because they're worth checking out. Sometimes it turns out that there's good stuff in there, and we want to be able to draw upon that, and if we want to say that they are wrong, we need to know why they're wrong. So if I want to say that Hume is wrong on something, I better know the Hume, not just some sort of Wikipedia or video or wherever the source is, thumbnail sketches on it, because otherwise I probably don't know what I'm talking about. So what were we? We were talking about. Oh,
Okay, so
so
for Anselm, I was thinking. Oh, sorry, you've got something.
well,
You go.
I
You
was
go.
going to say that just about apologetics, right?
Mhm.
Um, there are I've met a lot of Protestants who you could describe as conservative, but they're sort of a rationalist bent, and they want to use philosophical arguments for the existence of God, and combat whatever philosophical arguments are against it, as if it's like this big game, and you get to a point where like you've clinched it and you win. And there's a lot of Catholics like that too.
Right.
And they often tend to be very rigid, very focused on that sort of thing. I don't think anyone ever gets convinced solely by a philosophical argument that God exists or God has a certain nature. I think there's always got to be a lot of other things going on at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. I actually think I don't know. I can't speak for everyone, but I think something like personal experience and then combined with those, and that's where maybe that faith seeking understanding is like, oh, there's got to be something more. I had this weird experience, and now
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's that, and then there's something more communal as well that has to do with the way that we live as rational
Yes.
beings.
Okay.
So James actually has this nice expression again in the Will to Believe: faith in others' faith.
Okay.
And he's using it to try to
He
go
wanted
after
to be a
something
Christian,
else.
right?
What's that?
William James, he wanted to be a Christian, is that right? And couldn't
He
quite.
wanted to be a sort of a theist. I don't know that
Okay.
he wanted to be a Christian.
Right. Okay.
I don't
But
think he wanted
but
to. Sort of like Descartes, right?
yeah.
Descartes, he talks a lot about God, never about Jesus. And
Yeah.
to be a Christian, I think that Jesus guy better be pretty central. So,
Hmm.
but this idea that other people who you take seriously take something seriously, that shouldn't be by itself the sole reason for belief. If it is, then you've got real problems. But it could be kind of a
Right.
heuristic. So if I see, for example, Anselm saying something, which I mean, at this point, I'm not going to see him saying anything new unless I've missed something because I've read his entire corpus. But
Hmm.
if I see somebody saying something that I think is a bit weird, um, and I respect that person as a thinker, I'm going to explore it and see whether there's anything there. Whereas if I think that they're full of
Right.
nonsense, I probably will. Admittedly, if I was being epistemologically on track, I probably should check their stuff out as well, but I won't. And I even apply this
Yeah.
to like who I'm going to spend my time reading. If everybody who recommends a particular philosopher is a jerk, I'm not going to read that philosopher most likely because time's short,
Right.
and there's other people to read. So with Anselm himself, I started reading him originally, and I used this very volume
Okay.
to work on my Latin
Right.
because I had I'd essentially taught myself Latin, tried reading Cicero, realized that was too tough, spent another semester just going through the Allen and Greeno Latin grammar, and then started out doing some Aquinas, which is very, simple Latin. And then I was like, I need something more complex. I'm not doing Augustine, not doing Cicero. I'll read Anselm because I have to read him for my comps anyway for
Right. Okay.
graduate school. And I was just amazed at what was going on with the structure of thought within the proslogium. And then I was more willing to read what he had to say on other things. I read the Monologion and read the 3 theological treatises. And then I was, because of that, I was more willing to start doing other things. I started thinking, maybe I should pray the Liturgy of the Hours.
Right.
I like this Anselm guy. I'm trying to use the proslogion to not just as an intellectual thing, but actually as a prayer aid. Maybe I should start praying the Liturgy of the Hours because that's what he did, and it seems to have made some sort of impression on him. I'll never know unless I actually try it out.
Okay.
And if probably, and I can't say that I do it today, but when I did do it, it was quite productive. The Liturgy of the Hours is mostly Psalms with a few other things thrown in, and you do it at certain hours of the day. And it's sort of like the Muslim call to prayer, five
Yeah, sure.
times a day, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have a structured thing, you're probably, if you're somebody like me, not going to do a lot of praying.
Right.
And having these set things that you work through, there's something to that experience.
Right.
I probably wouldn't have done that if I didn't want to understand Anselm better, because
Right.
of
Okay.
the kind of person I am. Some people would do that because they'd say, oh, it's a good thing to do. But most of the time, I think in our lives, you could say that it's not arguments themselves that function as apologetics. It's people that function
Right.
to act as apologists,
Mm.
and they bring us in, and they bring us in through conversation, through something that's more flexible than just a knockdown, drag out argument.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think there's something to the community of believers and how
Yeah.
the Barna Research Group who they're actually saying that millennials think it's more about how you live your life than going out there and street preaching or whatever. And a lot of these older
Hmm.
conservative types are like, oh, the millennials are
The
ruining it.
world
But I
is
was like,
ending.
yeah, but I was like, I think in this culture, if you're going to go out there and say, here's with 100% certainty, evolution is false. Here's what, so you've got to believe in the Bible, like which is what I see on street corners and things.
Yeah.
It's like, man, it's not about that. It's about how am I living, or how do I deal with people, and then they're going to be interested. Whereas they're just going to think you're nuts. And
You know, so Anselm played a part in my coming back to the church.
right, okay,
I'd left I'd left officially when I was 16, but I think like a lot of kids at the time, I was never really there because
yeah,
catechesis was just horrible.
right,
And not horrible in the sense of like teaching us things that weren't true, or, being very repressive. It was just a vacuum.
okay,
A vacuum that was occupied by God is love, so be nice to each other. And I couldn't see why anyone would want to buy into that sort of thing. So I went on for quite a while thinking that religious people must be stupid, or there must be some cognitive bias or something like that.
mm-hmm.
And if you think that, well, it's really easy to find some
See it.
religious people like that, right? And to see things in that way. And I would still participate every once in a while in rituals, because my family was Catholic, and
Okay.
so I'd go to mass at Christmas to make my mom happy. And I was actually, a godfather, and we had to convince the family priest that somehow I would take that seriously, and that my sister would too. She'd left the church by then as well. But it was through reading people like Anselm and Aquinas and Maurice Blondel, and seeing that faith might not constitute some sort of blinders or impediment, but it might actually help them to develop and see more clearly,
Right.
to be better intellectuals. And then seeing not just, people like that who are in books, but real life people who are doing that.
Right.
That's what made the hugest impact on me. But that's because that's what I was looking for. In some
Okay.
other cases, somebody who thinks, for example, let's say they had pretty abusive parents who were constantly stressing the commandment, you honor your mother and father, and that sort of business, and dragging them along to services and yelling at them. Maybe that understanding of God as love, which can be unpacked in all these different ways, maybe that's what would do it for them. But they would have to actually see some people who exemplify that and live it out, not in a very necessarily dramatic way, like what goes into movies, but in a day-to-day way that we can see as being part of the fabric of our lives.
Yeah, I was reading a book called The Sin of Certainty by Pete Enns the other day, who's an ex-evangelical, and he's kind of become liberal, not a real Christian now, or whatever.
Okay.
But he was saying, so when he was at Harvard doing his PhD in theology, there was a girl doing a master's in the photocopy room, and so he was talking to her, and he says, "Oh, what are you doing your master's on, or something?" And she said to him something along the lines of why it's not God the Father but God the Mother, or something like that. And so he's in conservative evangelical mode, and he's like, I've got my PhD here. I'm gonna
argue it there.
I'm gonna argue the thing. I'm gonna show her why she's a heretic, why she's wrong. And then he says in the book, he's like, well, I realized like later on that, well, maybe she had, like an abusive father, and so the concept of God as a father is really difficult. And actually, what Christianity is in that situation how I deal with this individual. And he's like, I'm here doing my PhD at Harvard, and this whole thing was like just about proposition XYZ, boom, 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 win the debate with. Whereas really what he was like, what Christianity, what faith is about, is like that interaction and looking at the human being and how, because is God going to send her to hell because she's exploring whether or not it's God the Father or God the Mother, or is God going to look at that situation and go, Pete Enns, what are you doing? Like,
yeah.
I don't.
Anselm in the Monologian, he does say, well, it's better to call God the Father than the Mother, but he entertains the possibility because God has different ways of doing things. And we started out talking about this. Anselm did not get along with his dad.
Yeah.
And really cared quite a bit for his mom, who died unfortunately kind of young. So there's some serious theologians who took this idea seriously way back in the very rigid Middle Ages.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'd say father as well, but I think it's interesting that in terms of Christianity being more that it's not just about the reason, but the reason is actually a tool to be used, and there's something going on in there. I wanted to get onto free will because in the circles I'm kind of in, there's a big thing, I suppose, between it's Calvinism or Arminianism. It's Calvinism or Arminianism. If you're an Arminian, you're not a real Christian. If you're a Calvinist, you're a real Christian. Calvinists, they don't make any sense. Like this big debate.
It's cool that that's still happening,
but
in a way.
I found Anselm defines free will, so he doesn't even define it as the ability to like do something or not do something, right?
Well, he's defining freedom of
the
choice,
ability to like libertarian
rather than free will. And you might say, well, what's the actual distinction? Because some people like Descartes just kind of blur them together. They use the same phrase, libera voluntas, and or libertate voluntatis, and liberum arbitrium, right? And so he thinks that we have freedom of different sorts. Freedom of choice that's particularly relevant to us at the core level is the ability to keep rectitude of will for its own sake. And you might say, well, what the hell's that about?
Yeah.
Why make that so central? Because he thinks that is at the core of what we are as human beings. We're you might say moral beings. And it's not just moral in the sense of like ethics detached from everything else. This notion of rectitude of will, the will is it's not what the person is. It's still an instrument, he says, just like reason is an instrument. But those are the most definitive things about us human beings. And for Anselm, the will does drive reason. The will is the instrument that determines all the other instruments. So if you want to call him a voluntarist in that sense, I think he'd be okay with that. That's not to say that we don't have other types of freedom, like we can choose whether to sin or not to sin, in De Libertate. And we can, if you look at the later works where he brings up like the two inclinations of the will, like the De Casu Diaboli, and then the Cur Deus Homo, the De Concordia, and the De Conceptu, we have this part of ourselves that's directed towards what he calls happiness, or however you want to frame it. It comprises all of our basic drives, and it's quite malleable. We can shape it in different ways. So, you having books on your shelf is probably tied with that, whereas that's not the case for somebody else, or they have books on their shelves, not because they actually want to read them, but because they want to show off,
that's why these are there, actually. It's just so
there you go. There's even like rich people who have things that aren't really books. They're just like the spines of books, and you can buy a box and stick them on your shelf. But all of that is there for providing you with what Anselm calls the good of the things that are useful or that make us happy. And that's the sort of willing. We're constantly directed towards that. We sometimes will it deliberately. We're like, we think out, oh, should I get this or this? Like, think about when we're very trivial ways. Should I get Indian food tonight or should I get fish? Well, it is Friday. That does sound good. Comes with coleslaw, but I like the Indian food better. I'll choose that, right? So that's one whole thing. And then there's the will to justice.
Right.
And again, not something totally radically new in Anselm. You can find this also in Augustine and
but justice seems to play this crucial role in his kind of ethical theory as well.
Yeah, and justice is sort of like what we can call an architectonic virtue for Anselm.
Could you unpack that a
Yeah.
little bit? Sorry, I
So
don't think I've even heard that term.
when it's talking about justice in this very broad sense, it includes not just what we would call justice proper, like giving each person their due. It would also include things like temperance, for example.
Okay.
Or he is a virtue ethicist. He thinks in terms of the virtues. He uses that language quite a lot. Not so much in the treatises, but a lot in the letters, a lot in the prayers and meditations. And in part because that was the moral vocabulary of the time, really.
Right.
So strictly speaking, justice of the will is willing what God wills us to will. There's a theological component to it. But what the hell does that mean?
Yeah.
To figure out what God actually wants us to be willing. And simply like, finding a proof text in Scripture, that's not enough to tell us that that's what God wants us to do. We have to think about things. And so justice can be justice within the will is this disposition to choosing or prioritizing rightly. And as he says, there's this inclination towards justice, which can be lost. And then there's the inclination to happiness, and the will to justice somehow orders or superimposes itself on the will to happiness and keeps it from going off the rails.
Okay.
So, think about like, things that we particularly enjoy when it comes to temperance. So it's nice to have a few drinks with friends.
Yeah.
Alcohol is intoxicating. It feels good to be buzzed. And, you could tell yourself at a certain point, I really, I've got work to do in the morning. I should have 3 beers and then go home. But instead, you find yourself calling for shots and making an all-nighter of it and being intemperate, right?
Right.
That would be a case where the will to justice, you didn't choose the will to justice, you chose the will to happiness, and you chose it in such a way that it became disordered, right?
So the will to justice is kind of like the doctrine of the mean then, or is that...
It could be.
Yeah.
Some in some cases it would be. I don't think it necessarily in all cases. Anselm doesn't seem to be particularly conversant with that Aristotelian idea. But he has other things that he can appeal to as well. So but in any case, so that's one really architectonic virtue. I mean, there's 2 others, I would say, in Anselm's work, and one of them is love, or charity, and then the other one is humility. He says that a monk can't accomplish anything without humility.
Right.
And one of the works that was probably best known at the time is this thing that's called the De Similitudinibus, the on likenesses. And it circulated around monasteries, and it looks like some of it was straight out Anselm stuff. When Admer is referring to his teachings on virtues and vices, that's probably the core of it. And then other stuff got added from they put a little bit in from this treatise and this treatise. Sure. But he talks about humility as being genuine knowledge of self, knowing where you actually fit into things. And so if you think about, if you really had a proper conception of what you're like and what your value is relative to other people and in relation to God, you probably wouldn't be very happy with yourself most of the time. And even Anselm in his prayers, you see him, and he's a pretty good guy. He'll say, "I'm so filthy, I'm not worthy to approach you. My soul has got all these sores on it." Very descriptive. It's stinking, of its rot. And then he's appealing to the saints to help him out. And some of the time he's saying, you were kind of like me, St. Peter. Maybe you can help me out here. He's rather,
right.
He's pretty bold in the stuff that he says.
Yeah.
And you can say, well, what the hell's going on with that? Why did this guy think of him? Did he have like an inferiority complex or something, was he just doing it for show? Oh, look how humble I am, No, right. It's the closer you get to something that's genuinely transcendent, the more you realize how full of crap you are, and how much in need of like having all those gaps and holes and damaged things in yourself, how much need you have of that stuff being in some way fixed or redeemed. And you become more conscious of that, the better, the further along you are, the better you see things. So, part of the will to justice is realizing just how screwed up you are and trying to seek out things to keep yourself from going further downhill, Right. And when it comes back to freedom, right, we do have the freedom to do that. But as Anselm says, once you've lost that will to justice, you're inevitably going to screw up. You're inevitably going to will the wrong thing. It's not like you're going to will it wrong every single time, but you won't be able to stick with your resolutions. And so that's why you need divine grace. And you get the idea from reading Anselm's treatises that God is like constantly offering grace and people are constantly turning it down.
Right.
Rather than like God being this, distant being who's like, I'll give you a little tiny bit of grace. And that poor bastard over there, he's not getting anything. It's more like God is constantly showering grace. And in the De Concordia, Anselm is super clear that grace doesn't just come directly from God, it comes through other people and our engagement with them, which goes back to the need for community. But we have to cooperate with it for Anselm,
Perhaps we could get into
you have an epistemological framework that doesn't have any room for that. That's going to suck for you when you need it.
I was thinking about the relationship then between this kind of free will and Anselm's kind of ethics with sinning and what sinning is. So because I'm on a lot of in Protestant circles, I'd say the T in tulip. I forgot even what it stands for. I
used to remember
total depravity. That's it.
That's right.
Total depravity. Or versus we can do things that God doesn't will, so we're more powerful or whatever. And Anselm's how does Anselm kind of talk about this relationship between sin, free will, what God will?
Yeah, when we do the wrong thing, we will to do the wrong thing, right? So our will is free in some respect to choose bad things over good. Now, when we choose the bad things, we're usually choosing them as good in some sense. And again, this is straight out Augustine, right? Augustine says the same thing. City of God and on free choice of the will and things like that. And he illustrates it in the Confessions. So we choose the wrong thing, and we have the capacity to do that. And you could say, we're like screwing up the divine plan in that way, and we're taking the image within ourselves, and as he says in the beginning of the Proslogion, marring the divine image by all of this. You can say, well, why the hell does God let us do that sort of stuff? Right. Well, we're not really exerting power in that case. We're actually allowing other things to have power over ourselves. We have just enough power to allow ourselves to slip into the power of other things that make us worse off. So if we'll take an example. If I choose to take revenge on an enemy for who's really being a jerk to me, but let's say I adopt I'm going to show him, I'll visit him sevenfold for what he's done to me, Well, I'm in a certain way exercising freedom, but I'm also making myself less and less free. I'm, creating habits of taking revenge, which is not a good thing. I'm allowing these baser impulses, these appetites within myself to take control. I'm allowing my will to happiness to become deformed. Much like he says, what happened with the devil, when the devil fell, the devil's will to happiness remained there, but now it chooses the wrong things, and that's part of why he's such a poor bastard. That he's stuck, like always choosing the wrong things, like messing with us, for example.
So in terms of it sounds kind of like, and again, just after we're in the proslogian, just after the typical kind of ontological argument, that whole thing of why God can't tell a lie isn't a power.
Yeah. Or why God can't sin, or why there's a whole bunch of things like that occurring throughout Anselm's corpus, because this must have been a problem that they really felt to be an issue at the time,
But it's because we're not. But it's like the kind of converse of that for us, because we're contingent and
we can do those things.
Yeah.
But every time we do, and it's the same argument, right? He says that for God to be able to do these things in a certain sense would be for God not to be God. So there's a logical contradiction there. But why would that be the case? Because it would be for something else to be more powerful than God, right? It would when we choose these sorts of things, like we choose to lie, whenever we choose to lie, we're always doing the wrong thing, and choosing to do the wrong thing means to embrace a sort of impotence, and to embrace what's not good for us, and what we ought not to do. So, it's ruled out for God, but it's wrong to call it in a trivial way, because it's not trivial. But there's something about, if we actually understood what God is, the question wouldn't even come up for us. Let alone other questions like, can God create a stone so heavy God can't lift it?
Well, when you just said before as well, it would be for God not to be God. That made me think as well of that the question that's kind of to do with sin. Well, why can't God just forgive sin? Why can't?
Oh yeah.
Maybe that's something interesting to get, because I've seen it again, kind of atheist YouTube channels and stuff saying, Jimmy, you did wrong against me, I forgive you. Why can't God just do that? Kind of thing. Is like like an apology.
And sometimes they go further and they say, not only could God do that, God should do that in every case. So the answers that Anselm gives to these things have to do with what we call the interplay between divine mercy and divine justice. And his answer is that it wouldn't be just for God to simply have a blanket forgiveness, to have any sort of, like, anytime we screw up to give us a pass on it. It is an expression of divine goodness for God to forgive at least some, but there has to be some sort of, here's the general answer to it. There has to be some sort of conditions that preserve there being divine justice, because divine justice isn't just an attribute of God. It is what God is. God is the justice that through which all other things are just, and which means that in a certain sense, the justice of God is a bit beyond us, but we can still conceptualize it. And in point of fact, Anselm does think that God does, in fact, forgive sins. He offers the possibility of beings who are unjust being made just, and it's not so simple as like an on-off switch, or you're still the same being by being forgiven. Think of it as sort of being offered the chance to change, being given the opportunity and the grace to change yourself so that you're no longer such a screw up with all of these, failures within the very corpus of what you are, and you have somewhat less of those. You move towards being a more integrated being in the way that you were supposed to be as created.
Right.
That's the way Anselm conceptualizes it. That's actually something I'm working on a book on, and I've been.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I haven't made much progress lately, but I've written what I call a sort of triptych of articles
Okay.
on mercy and justice in Anselm. First
Yeah.
on the proslogion with a little bit of the monologion in it, then on how it works in the Cur Deus Homo, and then the most recent one, which will be coming out in a set of essays on Anselm, probably next year, is on how it works in the prayers and meditations, and
Right.
eventually
Okay.
sort of cobble this stuff together into
Yeah.
an actual book, because it is a really murky issue.
Yeah.
You know?
Do
And
you, do you
I
think,
think it's one too that really bothers a lot of people. Why do the atheist channels use that as a wedge? Because there is a sense in which I think a lot of people think, okay, you Christians are all about redemption and God is loving, and so why do you have this God who insists on acknowledging, like humbling yourself and acknowledging that you've screwed up, and
mm,
um,
yeah.
the flip side of that is that maybe a lot of the time that's actually how we human beings have misconceptualized things and used it as a way of having power over each other. Think about like
Right.
the sacrament of confession,
Mm,
or penitence or reconciliation. In a lot of cases it was used as sort of a tool to keep people in line and make them feel like crap, so that
mm,
they wouldn't do the wrong thing. But it can also be used in a very powerful way to help people understand what's wrong with them
yeah.
and understand how to get closer to whatever God is,
Yeah.
transcendent being, and to each other. Um, because one of the byproducts of like being right with God for Anselm is being right with all the other people who are right with God.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, if you
That.
look at like a proslogian, we're getting short on time. I'll
Yeah.
say
No.
this:
Yeah.
the,
Sure.
the the unum argumentum in the proslogion isn't the ontological argument. That's just a tiny component of it. The proslogion from chapter 1 all the way to the last 3 chapters, that's where the dividing line is one unum argumentum. It's one
Okay.
single argument that's supposed to prove these different things, and not like separately from each other, but all together.
Right.
But then he has these conjectures, these conjectiones in Latin, about what the great good that we're going to get is going to be like. And he says that in heaven, when we're enjoying this great good, we are still going to have wills, and all those wills are going to will the same things. So you
Right.
might say, well, that kind of sucks. Who wants to
Mm,
be like fused with everybody else? Well, we're not going to be. If we make it in, you and I will be there, and we'll all will the same thing because we will in God. But it'll be this like infinite
mm,
richness that allows for anything that's okay. We will,
mm,
and it'll be what he calls a concordia, a harmony, or a um, you know, an agreeableness of wills. And everybody who we've lost and miss and would like to reconnect with, and everybody who we never got to meet,
mm,
will be there with all of them. Will be fully human beings with wills, with intellects, with all these sorts of things.
mm.
And none of that will provoke the sort of stupid arguments or disagreements or any of that
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
here, you know.
Yeah.
So
That's
it's
very
kind of a nice
interesting.
vision.
Yeah, because I don't think I've ever thought about it in that way, in the way of um people's wills, uh, not avoiding conflict, but just there being a total absence of conflict because the wills are all in accordance with perfect rightness. That's very,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And, this is a little bit off topic, but so when people envision heaven, and I have my students do this, well, what's heaven like, right? Well, there's clouds and there's angels. And what are angels like? Well, they have halos and harps and all that. And we talk about that. And I'm like, that sounds really boring. I sure as hell don't want to go there. And then some of their jaws drop, why wouldn't you want to go to heaven? And I'd be like, well, how could you stand it after like 20 minutes?
Right.
And then we start talking about what heaven would need to be like in order to actually satisfy human beings.
Right.
And some things that, like, say, Thomas says, he talks when he's discussing the eternal law about how the blessed in heaven, they get to see the workings of the eternal law. That could keep you occupied for a long time. There's a lot of cool stuff there, I'm sure, because it's a whole like divine plan. But maybe not for eternity. You would have to be able to conceptualize heaven there's other ways of doing it, right? You can conceptualize it in terms of like physical pleasures. Yeah, I'm going to get to drink and screw as much as I want. That's the way some people picture heaven. But that would get boring very quickly. You've got to have enough that would actually satisfy the kind of beings that we are. And I think the only way that could happen is if you think, so this makes us all personalists, so to speak. Getting to know what another human being really is like and not being disgusted by them or repulsed at certain points, but being able to see all of the crap that was there and all the scars of it, but it all being somehow redeemed. That's probably the only thing that well, I shouldn't make that sort of inference. That's one vision of what heaven could be like.
That type of thing is, like the word, to use the word glory, I suppose, to use the when people really talk about what
is
heaven
glory
is,
like,
to really see the contrast of the brokenness of this world against that, like, I do think.
Well, and even the brokenness that we would be carrying forth as souls, I will. All the bad stuff that I've done would still have existed and have been done, but somehow it would be filled in with something good, And none of these Pollyannish, it all turned out good in the end, sort of nonsense sort of things,
Yeah, but truly to see that in its true ontological status in God,
That's I think sort of Anselm's vision of what heaven would be like. He actually told his fellow monks that this really threw them for a loop, that he would not like to go to heaven with any stain of sin, and he would be perfectly fine going to hell if he hadn't sinned. And they're like, you don't understand what heaven and hell are. And he says, no, think about it. Would you actually want to be in there? It wouldn't be heaven for you. Because you'd always be like, look, he doesn't say this, but you'd always be looking over your shoulder, like in the show, The Good Place, I don't really belong here. When are they going to find me out?
Or I think in C.S. Lewis's, is it The Great Divorce, where there's kind of like, there's like a theology club and stuff like that. And there's, I do often think the tendency of me, just because I'm in a church setting or because I'm doing theology or something, for all of my work traits to come out still in those kind of settings, where it's like, it's like am I whatever the telos is that God's leading life towards, am I really kind of on that path just because I've got a Bible in my hand and I'm exegeting scripture? So it's like, do you know? It's interesting.
That reminds me of a New Model Army line. I don't know if you know the band New Model Army. They're
no
British post-punk band, very talented, and they were pretty leftist, which is why they were the New Model Army, right? Okay. And they've got a song called Christian Militia where they're talking about, this is back in the 80s. They're complaining about the sort of moral majority types in the United States, and then they have this line where they says, with a gun in the right hand and sex in the other, Christ returns. And I think that a lot of Christians would be like, well, it's Christ, so good enough, but it would have to, simple, what would we call it, the formal trappings of religion are never, they're never sufficient for doing what religion is supposed to be doing.
Yes. Yeah. How much longer have you got, by the way? Because I don't want to keep you.
Maybe a couple more minutes.
Okay, sure. I suppose then, would you want to continue this conversation at some point, or I don't know what you want to do, if there's more you want to go into.
We can talk about Anselm or some of these other topics. Yeah.
Okay. So then I suppose, let me just, if I go over in terms of how we think about or come to the famous one, the ontological argument, then
Yeah.
how should we approach or think about that? Is it a set? Is it a set of premises that lead to a conclusion? Is it an experience? Is it what do you think Anselm's really getting at?
So I think it can do a couple different things. And, the people that you brought up that you wanted to talk about, they're all, from this quite good book called the Many-Sided Argument, I think it was called, right?
Okay.
And so some people have interpreted it as, like Karl Barth says, quo maius cogitari non possit is a name of God, and that's kind of an interesting take. And he's got a whole book on Anselm where he's saying Anselm's project is totally misunderstood. He's doing something quite different. And then you've got Gilson, and he has a paper on, is Anselm Christian philosophy? Or he ends up saying, no, he's actually Christian gnosis, like Clement of Alexandria is.
Right.
There was the Stoltz argument that it's really supposed to promote some sort of mystic experience. And I think it can do a lot of different things because people turn the argument into what they want it to be. So you can isolate it out as Proslogian 2 or 2 through 4 and use it in a philosophy class as an ontological argument. And it's a weird argument because it's, I think we do have to avoid trying to translate it into other things. So we shouldn't talk about like highest being or maximally perfect being or anything like that, because in his discussion with Ganillo, where Ganillo says you're arguing from this supreme being to XYZ, Anselm says, I didn't say that. I said God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Quo maius cogitari. And that's not the same as an expression as greatest being or anything like that.
That's interesting because Kant's kind of objection to existence as a predicate of the being of God.
And the existence as predicate thing applies way better to Descartes' version.
Okay.
In Meditation 5.
Yeah.
It doesn't really apply that well to Anselm.
But is it? Hang on, sorry. In Descartes, doesn't he say something about a valley and a mountain? Or am I?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, and existence is a perfection for him, right?
Right. Okay.
And so, I mean, the other thing though is to realize, and this would require more discussion. So there's two things I'll say.
Yeah. Sure.
One is, like I was mentioning before, the unum argumentum that Anselm says he's got there is supposed to prove that God exists, or God is, Deus vere est, right? Or esse, and that God is the supreme good, all other goods need in order to be good and to be, and then everything else we believe about God, or whatever else we believe about God. So the unum argumentum, that same formula, quo maius cogitari non possit, is used there in 2 and in 3 and 4, and then it's used there in 5 to talk about divine greatness or divine justice or all these other things, and then it's used to explain the workings of power and impotence and mercy and justice and why it is that God is greater than that which we can think. So the same thing is being used for all of these, and I'm not saying that we should therefore say, oh, treating it as an ontological argument is therefore philosophically illegitimate, but we should realize that it's part of a larger thing, Yeah. And the other thing is, if you think about what quo maius cogitari non possit, how that works for Anselm. So there's another essay in there. I think it's by Jacques Palliard in the Many-Sided Argument, and it's talking about Anselm and reflexive philosophy. This is a sort of like French tradition in philosophy that Maurice Blondel is a part of, and Jacques Leclerc and other thinkers who we don't read very often in English-speaking environments. And they I think rightly saw that part of what's going on in the argument is it unfolds itself, if we think about it. So it's not just supposed to be like a whole bunch of premises leading to a conclusion. It's rather like a set of thoughts expressed in language that when we go at them, they kind of recede from us and lead us into God. And I think that a lot of Anselm's work is that way as well. Like the Cur Deus Homo is not supposed to be just a treatise that like, okay, here's the definitive thing about the atonement and incarnation. Everybody get behind this and memorize these lines or anything like that. It's a dialogue in which Anselm and his student explore divine mysteries and penetrate into them somewhat. And you hopefully come out with a better grasp of those than you went in with, but you still don't, it's not like you ever master it. Because of the very object of it. And this is where, like, when Anselm is talking with Ganillo, that's one of the points that I think he's stressing, that the idea that we're working with, quo maius cogitare non possit, it is not something that somehow is in our head and is a copy of God or something. It's more like a device we use to.
The idea of the being God, which also has existence, which is like some kind of empirical thing. That I think like that is probably too often how the argument's thought about. Especially through, I don't know, I guess the modal logic of, like, say, Alvin Plantinga's version would work in that ontological sense, but again, you still think about it in terms of you can still come to that thinking that you think about this being with existence applied to it, that is in all the in some possible worlds, therefore all possible. Interesting.
The whole possible worlds thing is a really weird way to try to get at it, but people keep chipping away at it. It'll probably be around, and I'll say this sort of to bring it to an end.
Sure.
I spent a lot of time like thinking about the argument and thinking through it, and I still go back and forth myself, where I'm like, some of the time, I'm like, holy crap, I see it, and then other times I'm like, this is garbage, and then somewhere in the middle. And that means that it has a weird sort of set of hooks into our thought. That I think a lot of people would see as sort of pathological, but maybe that's how God gets his or whatever God is hooks into us through these sorts of things.
That's interesting. Well, thanks for your time to talk. And if
you're very welcome.
I'll message you on Facebook, and just whenever you're free. I know you're busy and stuff, so we'll figure something out at some point, I'm sure.
That sounds good.
Thanks for this, and have a good weekend.
You too.
See ya. Bye.